Well, a very warm welcome indeed to this How To event. Sadly, we can't all be with each other in person, of course, and I miss doing those on-stage events enormously, as you might imagine, but it's brilliant to have so many of you with us, hundreds and hundreds of you, right around the world, in Italy, in America, in Britain, and beyond. And it's a very special moment in a way because we're able to talk to the Italian physicist and acclaimed author as well, Paolo Giordano, who was right at the heart of this coronavirus crisis from the outset, in the very early weeks in Italy, in late February, actually. It was his rallying call that helped change public discourse. It helped shift the behavior of Italians and prepare them for the lockdown that would happen in the second week of March. And over the course of the next hour, I'll be asking Paolo to explain the trajectory so far, where we are now, and also, of course, crucially, how we emerge from this disaster. Perhaps most interestingly, though, and perhaps most importantly, I'll be asking, what sort of a wake-up call is this? How can we move forward positively? How can we use this perhaps as a final warning about our vulnerability, about our fragility in the face of a major crisis? Can we turn this to our advantage? Can we basically save the planet in a way that makes sure it is habitable by you, by me, and by Paolo in the coming years and decades? You'll be able to push through your questions as well. I'll ask most of them towards the end, as is the normal way for live events. Please do say where you're writing in from as well, because we are in this together. Yes, of course, as Emily Maitlis, the BBC Newsnight presenter, said very powerfully a few weeks ago, it's not quite right that we're all in it together in the sense that rich and poor alike are affected equally. That's not true, but there is still a sense, an important sense, in which we are now more than we ever have been, perhaps, a collective, a community, and not just a community confined by borders, but a community that spans the globe. So listen, Paolo, welcome specifically and particularly to you, first of all. Thank you for joining us from your very fetching apartments in Rome. Tell us how early on you anticipated the gravity of what's happened in recent weeks.
Hello, Matthew. Hello, everybody, and thanks for the invitation. Well, I would say, on alert since the end of January, because I was following the news as everybody, news coming from China. And I don't know, I think many people felt that this time could be a little different from the SARS epidemic in 2003. At the end of January, we had two cases, right, like 300 meters from where I live. The first two official Italian cases, two Chinese people who are in a hotel very nearby. And so I don't know if you had the same feeling, but especially in the first week, you felt like this epidemic was getting physically closer and closer every day. And that was a moment when I thought, okay, we're going to be in this, that something's going to happen. So, but then other weeks passed, and the 0 point for Italy was February 21st. And I wrote my first article for the newspaper about the mathematics of contagion 3 days after. And the week after that, I started writing the book. And I really did everything, and all of this against the confusion that was around, because the confusion that was in the minds of everybody caused delays that was very clear would eventually cause deaths.
And your article was shared no fewer than 3.5 million times. And as I said in my introduction, it really did stir Italians to action, or of course, the reverse, to inaction. We were slow in this country, in Britain. I think it is broadly accepted. There have been many countries around the world that have been slow in their response as well. But psychologically, I find it interesting how quickly we have been forced to accept a new reality. I'm 40, you're in your mid to late 30s. We have never known anything like this. It's not a war, of course. I'm lucky enough to be here in my home in London with relatively quite a bit of space, even a tiny bit of outdoor space. We're not being shot at, but it is nothing like we've ever experienced before. And yet we have adapted, many of us, incredibly quickly.
Yeah, that's always surprising to see how human beings are able to adapt. We are way more complex than a virus. A virus very quickly to adapt because it's a simple structure. We are very complex structures, but our minds are shaped in a way that makes us very adaptable to reality. And in fact, I watch more television than usually because I watch all the talk shows and try to gather all the information I can. And when I watch commercials, there are still some that relate to, let's say, the old life, where people gather and they do the usual stuff. And only 2 months have passed. And when I watch those commercials, they look as if they come from a very forgotten and faraway world. So we're also witnessing a very peculiar functioning of our brain, I think. How brain adjusts immediately to a new situation. On the other hand, I don't want to get too used to this lockdown. I don't want to get used to social distancing. I don't want to get used to seeing people wearing masks. I honestly don't like any of this. So I keep on telling myself this is necessary, but this is also temporary.
There is, of course, a worry, though, isn't there? That if we simply adapt back to normal, if and when this ends, that we won't have learned our lessons. And when you're sick, when you're physically ill, it's often very unpleasant to live through. But the moment you're better, you forget it. Very early on in this experience, I damaged my back. I don't even know exactly what I did because I can't go and see a doctor, but maybe I slipped a disc. It was excruciating pain. The moment that condition eased, I'd forgotten about it. There's nothing more boring than talking about pain or listening to someone else's physical pain. And what I worry about, and maybe we'll touch on this in more detail later on, is that if we don't use this as a wake-up call, if we simply adapt back to where we were in much the same way as that we have adapted to this new reality. So as you say, you look at a sports documentary, you see crowds of people together and you can't believe what's before your eyes. You can't believe that people are touching each other and so close to each other. The worry is that we adapt back rather than learning very, very important lessons.
Well, that's basically the reason why I wrote the book and why I wrote it so fast. I'm not used to quick writing. I'm usually very slow, but I thought exactly the same thing that you were saying. You know, there's an author, an Austrian author that I like a lot, Thomas Bernhard, and he wrote a lot about illnesses and the truth that you suddenly grasp while you're sick of something, and the way this truth suddenly disappears as soon as you recover. So I said to myself, we need to start some new thoughts now from within the contagion. The title of the book in Italian sounds something like Within the Contagion. And that was the reason for me, because I quote another title of a book that I loved a few years ago. It's by an author called Peter Cameron, and the title is beautiful. It's Someday This Pain Will Be Useful to You. So that's basically my thought behind doing all this. Even this talk with you, I'm discussing with people way more than I used to normally, because we need to make something of the pain that is happening. If we don't, we will be to blame for it, I think. And I think even the level of civilization of a society can be measured by what you are able or not able to do of the sufferings that happens. That also happens with human beings, but it's not going to happen on itself. I mean, I hear a lot of talk about this will change us for the better, we will be different, we will be more reasonable and sustainable and compassionate, but you know, crises don't really change things for the good. They usually do the opposite, and sufferings don't usually change people for the good. It really depends on what we do now and what we start now from within. And there's not a lot of time. I mean, in Italy, some measures will be lifted on Monday, starting from Monday. So we're all projected, we're all looking forward to going outside again and start again. So somehow the time for debating and thinking and imagining a different world has already passed.
We have to imagine a different world, though, don't we? This is not a crisis about climate change. And yet what it does is force us to come face to face with our own frailty. So in the past, even people such as myself, who intellectually, as most of us do surely, grasped the threat of climate change and climate catastrophe, emotionally it was very, very difficult to connect to. And there was this sort of inherent complacency that somehow we're human, we can put people on the moon, we can do live webinars, we can FaceTime people in Australia from our bed, we can catch up with people that we haven't seen for 30 years and set eyes on them as if we had seen them yesterday. We can do incredible things. You're a physicist, you pick the most remarkable aspects of what it is to be human, and there are many. But we thought that that meant, in a sense, we were invulnerable, that we were invincible. And what we know now is that we're not, because we can collapse like a bunch of dominoes. And that sense of our own fragility in the face of these threats surely has to galvanize us now towards not just action in trying to limit climate change, but also preparing for climate change as if it were another pandemic.
Yes, it's a sort of general test, very hard general test. But as you said, there is no connection between the coronavirus crisis and climate change. There is maybe a connection between even this crisis and, let's say, environmental behaviors that we have. And there is for sure a connection between environmental behaviors and possible future pandemics, because we saw it happening in the past many times. So this is one of the new thoughts. I mean, they're not new for many scientists and for some people, but they're new for the majority of people. And that's exactly, I think, one of the things that we should all come out of this crisis with. We need to come out of this having learned something about this, because it's a matter of prevention, basically.
One of the things that we have indisputably learned is how properly and fundamentally interconnected we are, and how reliant we are on each other. In one sense, we are only as healthy as our neighbour. I mentioned dominoes, but you use in the book as an analogy marbles. And just explain to us very briefly the marble effect so that we understand properly where we are at the moment and why we're actually in lockdown. This is to do with the R number. It's known as R0, and most of us probably taking part in this webinar have a fairly basic grasp of that now, but just in your own words, explain that and why that does make us so vulnerable, and why it means that we have to be so much better prepared and so much nimbler, so much quicker off the mark in the future. And in order to be quicker off the mark, we have to prepare.
Well, I wouldn't go into the mathematical description, because in English I may make it more confusing than I may confuse the ideas of people. But there is, I think, a basic concept, a basic idea behind this all that we need to have very clear in mind, that this virus is very new for the humankind. It's I was talking right before this this talk, I was talking to a biologist, and he was telling me that about 20% of the genome of the virus is completely new to us, which is a lot in his words. I'm not an expert on this, but this novelty means that all humans are susceptible to the virus, which means that we can all be infected. So we've just crossed the 3 million confirmed cases, but we need to remember that on Earth, we are more than 7 billion. So it's like nobody has been infected yet. This could simply be the start of it. And if there are 7 billion people that can be infected by this new virus, each percentage, let it be the lethal rate or the rate of people who need hospitalization, it can even be rather small in the end, but it leads to a disaster anyway, if we do nothing. So that's the big problem. It's a problem of numbers, of big numbers. And what we did so far is to try to protect not only the most vulnerable people, but the health system. And that's a thing that I found another brand new thing in our lives now. Nobody had ever thought of doing or not doing something to protect the health system, something as abstract and collective as our health system, but that's what we're doing actually. Yeah.
Because we've been pulled together at the same time as being driven apart. And there's something ironic about that, but also I think something very powerful. We can no longer go about our daily lives as if our principal responsibility is to ourselves. Many of us, I'm sure, over the many years of our lifetimes have been into work when we've got a cold, some people even when they've got a flu or something contagious. And we think that the only person we're really putting at risk is ourselves. We might make ourselves more ill. We can't do that anymore because the risk of contagion to someone else is now so serious. And as you say, to the health service in this country and Britain, it has all been about protecting the National Health Service, protecting the NHS so that it does not become overwhelmed. So this is turning us into a much sort of fuller-bodied citizen than we were before. And again, the sort of irony of that is that we're being citizens, more fully citizens, at the same time as being confined to our own homes. And I wonder whether you think that when we do emerge from this, and I don't think lockdown in Italy or in Britain will be overnight. I think it will be a very gradual process. And we could be in this for a much longer haul than perhaps some believe and many want. But I just wonder whether you think that we can carry forward that increased sense of citizenship into the way we live our lives in the future.
Well, again, it somehow depends on us, but you know, I just go back to what you were saying before for a moment, because yeah, there are many paradoxes we find ourselves in. I think that's an interesting perspective to look at the whole picture, the paradox idea. So one of the paradoxes is the one you mentioned. So we need we take care of other people by stepping away from other people. I mean, we used to tell children, go see your grandma, go see your grandpa, because it's a good thing to do and it's a nice thing to do. And now we're saying to them, don't go see your grandma. So that's a new paradox for us. But there's also a very strong paradox that concerns time, I think, because the action that we needed from the beginning was a very fast action, where we need the virus spreads very fast. We've seen that. So we needed to take action immediately, but the action we needed to take was to sit still in our houses and experience time in a completely new way, a destruction of time for us. And what were you saying? I lost the thread. I always lose the thread.
No, you touched on the important issue there. But we as human beings, and Plato said this in the Protagoras, we are consumed with what is looming before us. So we are tempted by what seems to be the greater good or the greater pleasure simply because of its proximity, whereas actually the greater good may be far further down the line. And greed is another word for that, I suppose. We need as a species, I think, and I don't know about you, Paolo, but we need, I think, as a species to realize that the way we live our lives, and I don't want to be a proselytizer here, and I'm someone who still eats meat, although I gave up eating beef a few months ago after being on stage at a How To Academy live event. And I was forced by the person with whom I was speaking, Jonathan Safran Foer, not forced, but encouraged to do something palpable. I'm not preaching, I still eat meat. I've been to 84 countries. You know, my carbon footprint is horrendous, but I am starting to change the way I behave, because I am starting to realize not just that it's much more important to be a community member than perhaps I realized before, but also because I am now emotionally, as I suggested earlier, more connected with the threat from climate change. But if you think about the ways in which most of us, or lots of us, do live our lives, we do eat meat, even though we know the damage that beef can do to the climate. We do fly around the world almost as though it is a rite of passage. We drive, we live lives of convenience, we heat our homes whenever we feel the slightest chill. How do we, as a species, start to change? How do we change quickly enough? And given, in some ways, the rather fragmented response to this pandemic, we've splintered in some ways, partly out of necessity, amongst ourselves as a global population. We've splintered into countries, and maybe that's also related to the increase in nationalism in recent years and strong leaders like Bolsonaro and Trump and perhaps Boris Johnson and others. I just wonder whether we need to act more collectively going forward, as well as understanding our roles as individual citizens much more profoundly than we have done. Can we change, do you think? And if we can, how do we do it?
Well, there's always a moment, whenever you talk about climate change with someone, there comes a moment in which you're asked, okay, so what do I have to do exactly to prevent this from happening? And the answer is, I don't really know. And you can give many different answers, but it's very clear to you and to me and to anybody that this is not going to change anything. So I'm more critic about this tendency that we have to make a personal problem, a personal issue of such a complex and big issues, because it's just another attempt to oversimplify the situation. What global climate change, exactly as a pandemic, is a global problem. It's a problem related to globalization. It's a problem related to the fact that we are more than 7 billion and so on and so forth. And it needs a global action, and it needs a structural action, cooperation, institutions, very strong global institutions that we don't have or that we didn't empower enough. Of course, we can do our small part. We can do our part in this by staying home, and we can do our part in facing climate change by changing our behaviors in what we eat, in how often we fly, and all the things that you mentioned. But let's not forget that we need to demand more, and the change has to be on an institutional level. We need to reinforce the organizations that we have, or build new organizations. I hope this will be a moment for the construction of a stronger cooperation, not only in Europe, but in the world. Unfortunately, you were mentioning nationalisms. This happens in the worst times of all, probably, because this epidemic happens in a moment of strong divisions. I mean, just after Brexit, just after tensions within the European Union, or with a president of the United States that in the middle of this attacks the World Health Organization. So the times, unfortunately, weren't moving in the direction for cooperation, but any other attempt that is more local or private is really directly going to failure. I hope we're going to understand this at least.
Well, it's interesting you say that. Luna Cardilli has written in to talk about this as a global challenge and to ask how are we tracking these challenges globally? What are the movements that we can join to make a meaningful impact in this very delicate and fertile moment? I'm now asking, can we coalesce as groups of citizens? You look at Extinction Rebellion, and that was, for right or for wrong in their methods, putting climate change on the map and in the news headlines in ways that it had really struggled to punch through in the past. Do you sense that we can come together as groups of individuals, or do we have to rely on the states? I don't mean the United States, but countries, and also international collaboration at a governmental level? What role can we play, do you think, Paolo?
I'm probably too skeptical. I'm not saying this is the right way, but I'm usually a little skeptical about movements that just happen and from below get to very important results such as this. Not in a situation that complex as this. So I think it's going to be probably a slower process that will go through elections again in our different countries, and maybe this will shift the movement, slowly shift the movement towards nationalisms and populisms, because maybe people will see that they prove to be inefficient simply. And if I would be very happy if just one idea emerged to many people, the idea that health security, for instance, is a global problem, because we just realized that if something goes wrong in a province of China that we had never heard about, it may affect us all in less than 2 months and put us in a situation like this. So this is a direct measure of how global health security has become. And if we all realize this idea, then the changes will come. They will come through elections, they will come through our representatives, and sort of climb the structure, I think. And that will be effective also for everything that concerns climate change, because we don't have to forget that climate change is much harder to tackle than this pandemic, because it's more elusive, it's slower, it's more controversial, and it always happens far away from us. At least that's what we feel.
Just on the question of pandemics and what this pandemic has done and where it's believed to have originated, can we briefly talk about that and how we can perhaps rather straightforwardly make the world a safer place. Maya Pastakia has messaged in to talk about zoonotic animal to human diseases, that is, like COVID-19, which she says, and I can't verify this, are responsible for over 2 billion cases of human illness and over 2 million human deaths, she says, each year. 60% of emerging infectious diseases are zoonotic, she says, and 70% of these are thought to originate from wildlife. So she says, isn't it about time that individual governments and more broadly the international community unequivocally state the proven link between the wildlife trade and serious threats to human health and call for a permanent global wildlife trade ban and the closure, Paolo, of wildlife or wet markets in China and other countries where they're prevalent to prevent a similar catastrophe from happening again. Is it as simple as that? Or are we to some extent all implicated in the global food chain?
Well, for sure, wet markets have proved to be a threat. So something has to be done about them, because in wet markets, wild species are come in close contact, and that's one of the best ways for new pathogens to make the spillover to human beings. So that's one of the questions. But let's not reduce the whole problem to that, because there are many other possible threats that are all related to our relationship with the environment and with ecosystem. I'm thinking about how poverty in Western Africa is pushing people to look for more and more bushmeat in the forests. And that's another possible threat, because that's another way of, let's say, making spillovers more probable, no more likely. Or let's just think about deforestation that grows year after year. Deforestation in the Amazons, which is one of the richest places in biodiversity on Earth. We cannot know what microorganisms live in the ecosystems that we are coming in contact with. So wet markets are one, or intensive farming is another very big issues that can be a major threat for humankind, for new pathogens. So there are quite many things that need to be fixed in our relationship to the environment, and all of them can be a source of threat for the future. Even climate change, even though it's still speculative, but if you just have a look at the website of the IPCC, you will find a whole section that tries to imagine how climate change will affect the spread of diseases in the future. So
I want to bring us back, Paolo, momentarily, specifically to physics. Luna has messaged in and said, what is your opinion on governments promoting the download of tracking apps and the potentially dreadful consequences of the privacy for the citizens? So that's physics, but it's also politics and it's human rights. We know that South Korea's approach has leaned heavily on physics, leaned heavily on testing and contact tracing as well, these relatively sophisticated apps. And I wonder how important you think that is in the fight against this sort of pandemic, and whether you think that we in cultures such as yours in Italy and mine here in Britain, whether we are sufficiently open now to that sort of invasiveness, whether in order to protect our health and our lives, we're prepared to open our minds to things we wouldn't have easily contemplated in the recent past.
Well, I went through a very strange experience, because in mid-January, so about a month before this all started here, I published an article, a very long review on the newspaper of this very important essay by Shoshana Zuboff that's called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. Many people probably have heard of it. And which talks for hundreds of pages about the risks of big data and big firms gathering all our personal data and so on and so forth. So I was very, how can you say, very interested in that perspective, which still sounds very important to me. And then this pandemic arrives, and I'm here in Italy waiting for our app, our tracking app, to be released so that I can also go out again and live a little more of my life. So this sort of twisted the perspective. Somehow, I think that on this subject, the question has been focused a little too much on the privacy issues, which are important, but are not, I think, the whole thing. The guidelines that the European Union gave to me sound quite reasonable. So the downloading of the app has to be voluntary, will be voluntary, at least in Italy. The data won't be kept for longer than, I don't remember, 2 months they're talking about. And there won't be a possible connection between personal and let's say that, I don't know the English word for it, but the data collected. So of course, this doesn't solve the question. And I've heard like Edward Snowden talking about this in very worrying terms, which I understand, but somehow I think we don't really have a choice. So again, it all depends on how it is done. And that's also why we need to do this, to talk about this as much as we can, exactly on how this will be done, because the how will decide the society that we will be living in tomorrow. Because most of the choices that are made now about the app, about powers that governments, new powers that governments have suddenly because of the emergency and all these subjects, most of these measures are going to stay with us longer than the emergency. So they are going to shape this new world. So this is really the time to not to miss anything of what is happening, I think.
Well, let's talk about shaping a new world, and not just in terms of climate change, but also how we function as societies and how politics might change. In a way, this is a sociological question, but perhaps whether we can make it a physicist question as well, the physics of changing. As we've talked about, you mentioned marbles earlier, and I wonder whether there's an analogy in there somewhere. This is a moment of great crux. I don't know whether people can hear in the background, probably not, but my street at the moment is doing its daily evening sing. I started it off a few weeks ago, and every day, every evening, neighbours from up and down the road, there are about 30 or so on a WhatsApp group, are now singing a song, sometimes even 2 songs. And there is a real sense that things can be different, and that perhaps after all, we can carry forward that change. There's a momentum, in other words. There's a sort of kinetic energy, to use a physicist's language. And I wonder, and this reflects partly a question by Liza Shashenkova, who says, do you think that the capitalist system as we know it will change? If so, how do you think? The joke in this country, if we're able to joke in these straitened times, at the moment that Jeremy Corbyn, our socialist leader of the Labour Party, left the stage, the magic money tree that he was ridiculed for by the Conservatives in recent years suddenly materialised. And the government was pumping huge amounts of money, millions and millions, hundreds of millions of pounds into the economy. Now, as we move beyond this crisis one day, it will be more difficult for politicians to say, well, we don't have the money. We can't invest in public services as much as you think that we can, because we can say, well, hang on, you did it when we faced that pandemic. So in other words, the way that we see the world, the way that we see and understand and perceive our own politics, are undergoing, I think, potentially a root and branch shift. And as a physicist, can you see potential there for this becoming a catalyst moment?
I don't know if I can see it with the eyes of a physicist, or if it's just, again, a matter of how optimist or pessimist you are. Again, I really do think it depends on what we do now, because this is not going to change the human essence. It's not going to make us any better. It proved that we have a rather weak system, because if after 4 weeks of lockdown here, we had people who were complaining in the street that they didn't have money for food, well, that's we're seeing a big failure. But what is happening is just a diagnostics, I would say. So the virus is sort of making a scan, a very deep scan of how our society functions. Then what we decide about this diagnosis, again, depends on, I don't know if there will come a moment immediately when we can do about it, but I think it really depends on the level of discussion that we have. So that's why discussing is the most important thing now, because we need to fix things before we forget them all and rush back to the way it was before.
You talk in your book about experts, and during the Brexit process here in Britain, experts were ignored by some and arguably trashed by others, deliberately, some would say. And yet now we face a crisis where experts should absolutely be to the fore, and they are, and the British government keeps saying that it is following the science, although of course in the end the science can inform the politics, but the decisions that are made are political. You point out that at this time of crisis, experts are split in some ways, perhaps in many ways. I think just for example of the WHO, the World Health Organization that you mentioned earlier, had been attacked by America, attacked by Trump. Well, the WHO has, last time I checked anyway, a very different set of criteria or timescale for when you should leave self-isolation compared to the advice in Britain. And so I wonder whether when we need experts most, our confidence in them might wane, might reduce even more, given that there is necessarily so much uncertainty still revolving around a disease that has almost overnight shifted our entire way of life.
Well, the problem is all ours. It's not the problem of science. The problem is that we don't understand science enough, probably. For sure, our politicians don't understand science that much, and they didn't trust science. Many of them didn't trust science before. Now, as you were saying, we keep on hearing, okay, we need to ask the experts, we'll follow the experts' instructions. And to me, after 2 months, it's starting to be I start to see science as a scapegoat of the whole situation. So we're not to blame because the directions were wrong. But, you know, experts are experts, especially today in the 21st century, in a very small part of the human knowledge. That's how science works. You become a super expert today in a very tiny part of the knowledge. So in this moment, we have economists, we have virologists, we have immunologists, we have social people who study social sciences, and so on and so forth. And each of them is giving a tiny piece of truth. But who has to combine all these needs that don't really combine that well? That's politics. That's what politics should do. And there's another thing that is happening. I think to give some more optimism, one of the best things that are happening is that we're listening to scientists way more than ever before. There are scientists everywhere. They keep on explaining and explaining. And one very important thing that they say is that we don't know this yet. We need to prove this. We don't know. We don't know. When did we last hear someone from the government or from politics say, we don't know, we need to investigate this, or just raise doubts and questions and not giving an oversimplified answer on a very complex subject? So I think this is an interesting lesson for all of us. Go back in contact with complex questions, with things that we don't know. And maybe when we get out of this, we will be a little less accepting, or can you say that? We will accept a little less oversimplified answers or just very rushed tweets. Yeah.
Because individuals are now empowered, are we not, to be more self-sacrificing than perhaps our own governments might demand of us. We've got so much information that we can look at what the WHO is recommending, or we can look at what our government, we can, in a sense, make a choice within the law, of course, of our own lands, how we act. So there's this sort of tension, isn't there, between individual responsibility and the responsibilities that are imposed upon us from above. I do just wonder, Graham Grant has messaged in to say, he's in the UK, do you feel the credibility of organisations such as the WHO has been affected by the pandemic? And do you feel that changes will be made to such organisations to help with future pandemics, such as reporting?
Well, it would be very weird, no, if we didn't empower more and fund more these organizations in the future, because we have a direct comparison in a way. We've seen countries like South Korea or Singapore that went through more recent epidemics like SARS in 2003 or MERS in 2012. We saw how they dealt very efficiently, well, let's say way more efficiently than all Western countries, because they had procedures, they had know-how, they had memory of this all. So the whole world now, this is not happening just in 3 countries. It's now happening everywhere. And this is, again, this is brand new. So something has to change at this global level. And the organizations that we have are there. We'll have to do something with them. And yeah, I really do hope this will be in the direction of improving and empowering them.
How do we emerge from the lockdown? And how quickly and effectively do you think?
Pale, very pale.
Because I talked to quite a few older people through this crisis, and so many of them feel that they should actually be sacrificed themselves in order for societies to continue to function, in order for economies to continue to thrive or to start to thrive again. In other words, some older people that I've spoken to would be prepared, reluctantly of course, because they're human beings just as you and I are, with their own hopes and fears and ambitions, but they'd be prepared, I think, some older people to be told, okay, you've got to lock down for longer than everybody else, and allow the younger people, some of whom will still be vulnerable, of course, allow the younger people to get back to work. And I wonder, given your understanding of R0 and the need to drive it below 1, I wonder, it was a very controversial part of the early conversations that were being had at a governmental and scientific level in the news conferences here in the UK. But I wonder where herd immunity might end up fitting into this. So would it be possible, for example, if the older population stayed behind, the younger population came out develop some sort of herd immunity so that it would then be safer for older people to come out in the future. That suggestion is simply something that I have thought about, and I stress it's got no underpinning in science, but I wonder whether you can help us with that and also answer this question when we talk about emerging from lockdown. Can we only really come out with any proper confidence when there's a vaccine?
Well, I'm not an immunologist, so this is just from the evidence that I gather. But one tricky point is that we don't really know how the immunization for this virus works. We don't know that well enough to bet everything on. We don't know how long it will last or how effective it is in anybody. So from the very beginning, like pointing everything on herd immunity was a little risky, at least, and I think it still is. And we don't really know that there is this, something is happening here in Italy, which is a little scary, a little worrying, let's say, because on next Monday, we're going to have the first liftings of the lockdown, not for all the people, but for many, for the industry, basically. And there is this idea going around that many people think, okay, I had it. I didn't know it, but I had it, so I'm immune to it right now. We'll know that only when we have the blood tests. I don't know how you call them in English. But so far, the level of immunization has proved, where it's been measured, lower than expected. So it's a long way to herd immunity anyway. And we need to find different strategies. We need to find a strategy to live. We don't know how long the road is to the vaccine. So we also need to find a way to live in the time between. And we cannot lock down all the elderly people or all the vulnerable people until we have a vaccine. That would be inhuman. For sure, I think the next phase will really be about individual responsibility. We'll have the app, we'll have all sorts of testing, maybe. We've learned a lot, but it will be about individual responsibility. And each one will have to measure also his own vulnerability to this disease and behave accordingly. I don't really see any, let's say, structural idea that can solve the situation now. We'll go out and maybe we'll have to lock down again, or just take 2 steps forward and then 1 step back. The truth is, nobody really knows.
And in such an uncertain environment, the reliance that we place on news is obviously vitally important. And I use the word vitally in its Latinate meaning of the word, vita vitae, life. Our lives depend on accurate information that we can trust in a world where there is, as I say, so much uncertainty. And I wonder what your view on fake news is. Because in one sense, the fact that we are so interconnected on the internet and in its many different guises can be hugely helpful. It connects us together in sometimes life-saving ways, but it can also be a very powerful mover in the opposite direction. How do you feel in this crisis we have coped with social media?
Well, fake news, they really spread in a similar way as viruses. It's an infection. That's why we use the word viral 3 months ago to say that something was really successful on the internet. Now, probably we're going to change that word into something that's less nasty to hear. We've had an incredible amount of fake news. Well, it was there before. We know that things like Brexit was driven partly by fake news, but this time it was very, very clear and very strong. And one thing we are learning, I think, is that not only fake news exists, but there are inaccurate news, there are incomplete news, there are news that are just a little too rushed. Something happened here in Italy in mid-March, so in one of the worst moments of the epidemic in Italy, when we were having really a lot of deaths per day. A pharmacist who was in Japan did this video selfie of himself. He was walking around Tokyo and people were on the street, and he was saying, here everything is okay because they have a drug that is effective, that is completely effective against COVID-19, but this drug has not been taken or accepted in Italy and in Europe. And so the information that he was giving was partly true and partly inaccurate. So that drug, there was immediately a lot of discussion about that. You call it drug or you call it medicine? How do you call it?
Either is fine, yeah.
Okay. And so the testing started immediately also in Italy. So we can say that the news had a good effect, but at the same time, I was thinking about the people who had maybe their parents in intensive care that day, who were watching that video like me on WhatsApp and saying, okay, so there is a cure, but my father is not getting the cure because the state is not giving it to him. And what amount of pain did this put on top of the pain that was already there? So there are many nuances between truth and fake. And in a situation like this, it's very difficult for all of us to distinguish. So I think, again, there is an individual responsibility in this, because we're learning how social distancing works. Well, we might as well learn how social media distancing works. Maybe just not spread information without taking a moment to check it, or just to wonder a little more. No, that's something we might learn in a situation like this.
So Osvaldo, who's an Italian living in the UK, he's concerned, I think, about the spread of fake news and wonders how central governments can act to stop spreading fake news and encourage us to listen to experts. There are these sorts of questions, aren't there, about how we get the balance right between the freedoms that we have been afforded and that we take for granted in so many ways, and also the ways in which we need to be protected from ourselves, I suppose. There is, again, this sense in which the good of the collective does rely on, in a way, a series of individuals taking responsibility. So
that's always a problem.
And of course, the police can shut us down, but for it to work, because there aren't enough police officers, and what are you going to do with people you arrest anyway? Put them in prison where they might be at great risk of COVID. It does actually rely on our participation. It's been fascinating to watch how different human beings have reacted. Some have followed the government guidelines absolutely to the T. Others have ignored it quite spectacularly. We've seen a very, very stark range, I think, in the psychological responses of individuals. And that leads me just to ask you, because we haven't got much time left, but we haven't touched on mental health and the psychology of being in some ways alone, or indeed in the cases of many, perhaps trapped with people that they don't want to be trapped with. Have you got any grasp of just how wide scale these challenges to our mental health are, particularly when there is this emphasis on individual responsibility. In a sense, we have to self-diagnose up to a point. Of course, we have access, if we need to medical advice, but we have to accurately convey our symptoms to doctors or to health experts in ways that perhaps we're not used to, because we're not often seeing them face to face. And people, of course, could continue to go into work when they shouldn't go into work. So the system does, and I come back to this point, rely on individuals to play their part, but that in turn can put pressure on individuals, and potentially that might lead to mental health issues.
It will, for sure, but we probably need time to see it. You know, there are many, we now all have clear enough what the curve of contagions is, no? The rise in the number of positive people, even the rise in the number of dead people. But there are other curves that are in the meantime growing. There's a curve of the people who will suffer and die because of the economic consequences of this. And there is a number of people, and there is a curve of people that will suffer and die because of the social and psychological consequences of this. But these two curves are way more complex to figure out. We just have many examples, like domestic abuse against women, and domestic violence was a major issue of this since the beginning. So we were locking down people in their houses, but trying to forget that not all houses are the same, not all families are the same, not all mental situations are the same. So this is, in my opinion, this is the most violent thing that happened so far, because it's a direct consequence of the simplification that the virus does of humanity. So the virus is only interested in whether we are susceptible, so we can be infected, or we cannot be infected. It doesn't know anything about us, about our lives, our desires, our issues, all the things that define our lives normally. And so the measures that we need to take are at that level of simplicity. Everybody stay home from today for the next weeks. But then we immediately realize that we're not all the same. We're not in the same situation, where we don't have houses that are the same space, the same level of wealth and security. But we're going to see the effects of this afterwards. Again, I think this is a moment for writing down everything also that the virus is revealing about our society, because all these problems that usually are invisible and hidden in society, people who are almost invisible to us, somehow in a situation like this, their situation is coming out and in front of our eyes. So let's use it at least as a, how would you call it? A study, a scan.
And I just wonder, to finish with, whether you feel that we have revealed more good about ourselves than we have bad, and how we can avoid being fatalistic, how we can be optimistic, how we can fill ourselves with hope. President Roosevelt said at the height of the Great Depression in the early 1930s, in his inaugural address as president, he said that there's nothing to fear but fear itself. I think that's psychologically quite an interesting thing. So we shouldn't fear the virus. Of course, we have to respect it. Of course, we have to understand that it is a deadly and contagious virus. But the real thing to fear is fear. How do we manage to move forward positively? And as I say, do you think more good can come out of this than bad?
I think I was having this discussion with my kids. So they are not yet in the, let's say, grown-up world. They're studying, they're still very young. And what I honestly believe, but that's just out of I don't know, instinct. It's just a feeling. It doesn't have any scientific proof. It's just a feeling. But 4 months ago, I was thinking of their lives, about the lives that was waiting for them, and I was sorry for them somehow, because it simply looked to me as if it could only be a little worse than the one I had and the one my parents had. And for the first time, I told them, you're going to see another world. You're going to have opportunities. You're going to maybe to live even in a more just world, or with, it's just a sense of that something's opening after this situation, like some clear sky after a very awful storm. I don't know if it's true, but that's what I instinctively feel about them. I think the problem is more for our generation, who are is a little caught in between, in the middle of things, and that's going to be a little trickier, I think.
We have to hope, I think, that we've, in a sense, and this may be an odd thing to say given the extent of the suffering in so many different ways, but we've, in a sense, been sent to our bedrooms, perhaps, to reboot those of us who survived this. And of course, we are all, to a lesser or greater extent, vulnerable to the disease. Sent to our rooms to consider how we move forward as a species. And it does feel to me that we're on the precipice of potential catastrophe if we don't get this right. And that the me culture is going to have to shift extraordinarily. At the end of this, I'm going to say people can find you on Twitter, they can find me on social media, but it's that sort of look at me attitude that is going to have to shift, and have to shift quite quickly. Of course, we can harness the brilliance of individuals, and human beings have been often, I think, at their most creative at moments of flux, at moments of catastrophe, at moments of crisis. And I'm sure the most enormous amount of creativity not only is already emerging during the lockdown, but will be shown to have emerged. I think, just for example, very early lockdown video of two young boys, I think on the island of Sicily in Italy, who are playing the violin together beautifully. I think they were playing a Coldplay song. And that, for me, in a sense, just symbolizes what is possible as a human being, even when we are in our most confined state, even when we are in a state in which we were not intended to be. We are a remarkable species. There is great beauty in the world. There's great beauty in each other. And if we can somehow harness the horrors of what we've been experiencing, as I say, in so many different ways, in so many different shapes and sizes, and to so many different degrees, I think that possibly we can move towards a better world.
Yeah, but let's not put it all on people's shoulder, I think. People's shoulders. Let's demand, let's become more demanding from even the ruling class. I think we need to become more demanding in the questions, in the answers, in the complexity, in having people who understand the situations. That would be quite a lot already.
Well, Paolo, your book is out. It's called How Contagion Works. How can we find you on social media?
I've always been very against social media, but I'm on Instagram. Yeah, I'm on Instagram, and I think you would find me quite easily. I'm also on Twitter, but I never look at it, so I don't know what it happens. Twitter makes me really, I find it very confusing. It's
I do look
too
at Twitter.
fast.
I also use Instagram, and I'm at Matthew Stadden. Listen, it's been in strange times a pleasure to host my first webinar with you, thanks to the How To Academy, Paolo. It's been fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank you for treating us to this in your second language. I mean, you put us Brits to shame, given how poor we are at foreign languages. Quite remarkable that you can conduct a conversation in English to the extent that you can. And also, I should say, you write beautifully in English. It's a book that is lyrical, actually, even though it is talking about disaster. And it does find hope and it does find beauty in the mess in which we find ourselves. So thank you very much indeed to you, Paolo Giordano. Thank you to the How To Academy for facilitating this, showing us how adaptable we can be as human beings, how we can connect from London to Rome to America, right around the world. And thank you as well, not least, to the hundreds of people who have signed up for this evening. We've got many more of these sorts of talks and conversations to come as the weeks progress at the How To Academy. So do join us. Also, you can find our podcast series on the How To Academy website, and that is hosted largely by me and Hannah McInnes, but also by special celebrity guests. It's a fascinating series I hope you'll discover. Thank you, everyone. It's been really good in difficult times to connect in this way. Stay well and stay safe.